Hello, my name is John Solomon, and welcome to the latest in the Cybersecurity Advisors Network's series of video and audio recordings and chats with information and cybersecurity experts in technology, policy, legal, geopolitics, and related fields relevant to the industry around the world. This video series is brought to you as a part of the Cybersecurity Advisors educational and informational channels and activities. The Cybersecurity Advisors Network is a not-for-profit global trust network of security professionals and practitioners, as well as interested parties in various areas of expertise that are germane to the cybersecurity industry. I'm here today with Geoff Leeming. He is co-founder and cybersecurity expert at Pragma, a global cybersecurity, risk management, and regulatory consulting organization. And we're here today to talk about surviving an incident response. So without further ado, Geoff, if you'd like to give us a few words, who you are, what do you do, and why are you in cybersecurity? What's your background?
Hi, John. Good to meet you, and thank you for having me on the podcast today. And can I just say first, what an impressively cluttered background you have on the screen. I'm feeling quite worried about the bare walls behind me now.
We have Baroque and elegant.
Great stuff. So yeah, I've been working in cybersecurity for slightly over 30 years now. I got into it almost by accident in the early 90s in the UK. And I spent most of my career running teams for investment banks, but I've now set up Pragma, and we are a pure cybersecurity and regulatory risk consultancy. But we deal a lot with post-breach incident response. So we work with a lot of insurance firms and a lot of law firms. And this is a real change in pace for me. I spent years working with massive budgets at investment banks with some of the best teams and the best tools and toys to play with in the world. And now my client base are the ones who have been hacked, and they are everything from small businesses to multinational firms. And really the change in focus is immense to see. And it's wonderful to be there at the cutting edge to actually deal with the real life incidents as they happen and know that you're bringing a company back to operations again and getting it working again. It's great fun to do. So I got into security as an accident, but now I'm here because I'm seeing the difference I'm making. I'm seeing the effect on businesses around the world. It's great fun.
So you're from you've got a couple of years on me in experience, but we're from about the same generation. I also dropped in by accident when somebody, a sales guy dropped a firewall book on my desk back in 1997 and said, "Congratulations, you're the expert. We're going to see the customer in 30 minutes read up." So I think our generation of security experts is very often has kind of fallen into this area as you put it by accident, and I think that brings me to my first question. One of my earlier roles was helping a colleague develop an incident response team, and this is back in the dark ages when there was no such thing as an incident response team, and we basically made things up as we went. This was the result of a happy for us, unhappy for them accident where my colleague was brought in by senior management to tick some boxes and have a look around. He said, "You guys have a lot of unpatched, older Sun OS and Windows 3.5.1 boxes." And the manager basically told him on Friday, yeah, kid, go away, you bother me. And I think the Tuesday after that, a SQL Slammer hit and took everything down, or Code Red, one of those two. He gave me a frantic call and said, "Hey, I need help." And I didn't, neither of us knew what we were doing. And this is for the world's largest banks at the time, which is not reassuring. So I guess, with that very, very long preface, my question to you is, you, like me, mainly come from the background in the preparatory preventative space, and you've now gone into the response space. Mm-hmm. What has changed in your view in that response space? What are the biggest observations that you've made in terms of the level of professionalism, technology, formalization of how especially large, but not only organizations handle what they do when there's a crisis, when the worst case scenario happens?
Okay. So yeah, I've had a long career and I've been through some interesting crises in my time. And I was working for Leeming Brothers during 9/11. That was a fascinating time because the Twin Towers wasn't just a sort of an American icon. It was also our global headquarters and data center. I was working for Barclays during the Fukushima, in Asia during the Fukushima earthquake. So there's been some interesting times. And I think the bit that really swings it for me on large companies and setting up an incident response team, the first question is why? And the second question is, are you really sure you want to do it yourself? Because one of the things I found moving from banking to a company that specializes in incident response is I've got to employ some really interesting, talented, expert incident responders. And if I don't feed them a steady stream of interesting incidents, they get bored and they move on. Now I go and see some of my clients who are large banks and they pay an awful lot more than I do. And they get some really great people in there. And then they sit them there. And because the banks have good security, these guys are doing nothing. They're writing processes. They're dealing with rather low-level incidents. And they're slowly going insane. It's like a security guard sitting there with a bank of 100 monitors on which nothing ever happens. So the first question is why do you want to do it yourself? It's a very specialist set of skills, and often it's a lot better to outsource that to people who are doing it all day, every day.
So that's a good segue into my next question. And there's always this perennial balance between insourcing and outsourcing, especially again in larger organizations and particularly in the financial sector. It's a really well taken point about having people. I guess it's like a kind of a sheepdog, a working dog. They need to be challenged. They need a task. Otherwise, they get restless and bored and chew up the couch. Let's talk about not preventative. Let's think about where does PBIR, incident response, generally fit into a risk management framework. So before we even talk about preparatory, how do you make sure that you've covered all the bases in terms of having a capability? Not necessarily an in-house team, but understanding why you're doing this as a part of managing your overall cybersecurity risk, and understanding that you have exactly the right type of capability, whether it's insourced or outsourced, to respond when something happens, to identify, to classify, to follow up, etc.
For me, the thing that really brings it home is seeing insurance companies in action. So I spent the majority of my career in-house in banks, when we had our budget process and we were trying to divert scarce resources. And we were always trying to work out, my master's degree told me it's simple to work out how much a risk costs. Just work out how much it's going to hit you for and what the probability is of that happening, multiply one by the other, and that's your expected loss. No one has ever mentioned that to me again in working life since then, because it doesn't really work like that. So when you see an insurance company working, they are trying to manage the overall costs to the business and trying to keep that down and keep that managed. And you see from the way they focus on how to manage an incident, really where the most effective ways of managing risk are. Often it's not, okay, we kid ourselves, we're in a tremendously technical industry, and we are, but often the keys to success aren't the technical brilliance. It isn't the analyzing a 0 day and being the first person to know exactly how the thing works. It's really dull. I'm sorry. It's about process. It's about communication. It's about efficient allocation of resources to get to your end goal. So one of the things I say a company always needs in its incident response team is somebody who actually understands how your business works, because that's where you're losing money. Now, when we go in and do a breach response, we charge by the hour, and our rates are not small, but our fees pale into insignificance beside the fees charged by the lawyers working on these cases. And their fees pale into insignificance compared to the business loss that the insurers are paying out. Every day that you can't do business effectively, the company is losing an immense amount of money. And the actual technical costs of a response are usually a tiny fraction of that. So first thing you need in a CERT team is somebody who understands what your company does for a living and how that works. And that's the person I very rarely see in response teams.
This is really serendipitous that you should, it's almost uncanny that you should bring this up, because this is precisely...
You did promise me $10 if I said it, John. So
I got a good beard collection here if you want to come partake sometime. No, because I had two separate conversations yesterday which touched very, very strongly on elements of what you just mentioned. And one of these was about, about insurers in terms of not the way insurers do it, but the way they focus on certain cybersecurity risks and how they price in risks and capability, management, risk management to cybersecurity risk insurance policies. And the other one about calculating loss, right? When we see annualized loss expectancy and risk management, I couldn't agree more with you that just looking at it from a risk impact times probability equals ALE, it's insufficient, right? And this also touches on another topic I want to cover a little bit later, which is regulatory requirements, because as the concept of critical national infrastructure grows in critical industry, we see regulators taking a more proactive hand in telling companies, no, you cannot just decide for yourself what your acceptable risk is, your risk appetite. You have an impact on society. So we'll get onto that. You mentioned Ofcom in our preparatory conversation. That's a really good one.
Live exactly what you're talking about. They're doing exactly that right now.
So I want to expand a little bit on this concept of the business awareness. I mean, you mentioned having somebody in the risk management team. My experience has been that the CISO over the last 5 or 10 years has become more of a business rather than a technology function. Do you see this as something that has been percolating down through the operational and response parts of information security capabilities in larger firms, especially over the last few years as well? Or is this something that's mainly stayed at management levels?
Well, I think the CISO has always been a political role as much as anything else. And when you're operating inside a large organization like a global bank, then the political skills on getting your people in the right place and the resources in the right place are a very large part of the job. But I think that sort of trickle-down effect of having the responders, the people on the ground, the arms and legs who are actually doing the work at the end of the day, understanding how a business works, that I still don't see much. And that's a shame, I think.
Well, this is a question for me, actually, because when I gave a keynote at a conference a couple months ago, and it was a hardcore geek conference. And I'm no longer a hardcore geek, far removed from it. I'm a risk manager at heart, and I gave a talk about risk management, why it's important. And my first slide was, this is going to be the most boring thing you see all day, but this is also going to be the most important thing you see all day, because this is why you get paid. Now, a lot of these guys, super technologically gifted individuals, really bright, you talked about incident responders being bored by sitting around, but isn't there also a risk that they're going to get bored by the boring business, financial, PowerPoint-y, Excel stuff?
You don't need everyone to know that, but you do need those skills somewhere in your incident response team, whether that's with the lead or with a particular analyst. What we often do is we pair it with project management skills, because if somebody knows what needs to be done as a priority to get the business back and working, and the skills to manage the process and the work towards those priorities, those things happen to go very well together. But putting a project manager in an incident response team is an unusual thing to do. And the super geeky people, like myself, I still try to be at least, and often see that person as an interloper. But in fact, they offer some... I had one analyst a few years back. This is one of my most talented technical analysts, but I tried to put a project manager on a job with him, and his response was, well, why do I need that? A project manager is just a secretary. I don't need a secretary. That's why we kind of missed the point here.
Well, one thing, I mean, speaking of the term secretary, it blows me away that that it's become almost a denigratory term rather than, I guess the 19th century, the all-knowing, all-seeing, person who can bring parts together. And I think the closest, the thing that came to mind when the moment you said project managers, there's two bits here. And the first is this adage of, amateurs, they study tactics, professionals study logistics, right? So for me, part of an overall ability to manage the risk of a potential incident is not only understanding the potential impact, but understanding also the supporting capabilities, such as you just pointed out, very, very, very insightfully, I think, having a coordinator, having a project manager, somebody who can basically pull together all these threads, who knows what the resources are, right?
I mean, I don't want to sound like an incident response team is just a project manager and a business analyst. And you do need that hardcore skills. You need, a lot of our clients getting hit by the MOVEit vulnerability at the moment. And you need somebody who can understand how that vulnerability works and the implications of that and how to turn that back into a response. But I think my point is, unless you are leading a full-time incident response team that's working every day, you don't need to be the person who finds it out yourself. You need a threat intelligence feed, you need an analyst feed who can tell you that, but then you need to be able to move on and have the technical skills to understand how to apply that knowledge. I see too many large companies sort of investing in threat hunters and malware reverse engineering people. Yeah, you can get someone else to do that more effectively with better practice.
But also, I didn't in any way mean to imply just it being a project role, but it seems to me, you've got to continue the bad military similes. You've got the tanks, and you've got the guys who know what the tanks are capable of and where to send the tanks and how many of them are, how to get more of them, etc. Same with threat intel feeds. I talked to a large financial firm about 7-8 years ago. Well, no, a large impact, small size financial firm. They had a 20-person information security team, and they had 22 threat intel feeds.
Wow.
Does not speak to me, all of them commercial from different vendors, and that does not speak to me of having that kind of coordinating, controlling capability. What leads me to ask you about is the second element I was thinking of when you said project management. A couple of years ago, I came into a fresh job, full of piss and vinegar, wanting to change everything. And my first idea was, let's build an incident response team because we don't have any. And a much more experienced, much wiser colleague of mine basically thought about it and came back and diagrammed the various elements of an incident response capability. Everything from help desk to human resources to third level support to legal to communications. And it seems clear now, it blows my mind, right? Can you talk a little bit about what such, I love the term capability, right?
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about what some of the major parts of being prepared for an incident, for a breach are, and what companies can think about in terms of understanding, who the stakeholders are, the affected parties, and how they should be talking to each other, and how they can prepare for that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, there's lots of things a company can do in preparation to understand and to increase their chances of surviving a breach. I think a lot of them align very closely to what the main types of attacks are at the moment. So we all know ransomware is happening. What a lot of people aren't necessarily seeing is that a lot of ransomware, instead of encrypting your data and demanding ransom to get it back, they're moving more and more to exploiting privacy legislation. So they'll just steal your data and hold you to ransom about whether or not they're going to publish it or not. So to me, the biggest thing you can do to prepare for that is to understand where your PII is. And you'd be amazed at how many of our clients don't. In fact, I struggle to think that many of our incident response clients who could give a straight answer to that. Well, many of them have given a straight answer to that, but we find it not to be entirely true later. So just knowing where your PII is stored is going to really focus any investigation. It's really going to streamline it. And also, just by knowing where your PII is stored, it makes you think of, okay, so now what do I need to do to protect it? It helps bring down the likelihood that it will get breached. So that's number one. Go out, crawl yourselves, find out where it is, find out how it's protected, see if you're happy with that, and do something about it. So that's one. I think the other thing we see is backups. And listen, I've been in security for what? I started in 92, so over 30 years now. And backups has been security 101 for over 30 years now. And everyone says, yeah, we've got backups. That's fine. It's not a problem. We've got that sorted. And then we go in and they go, okay. Well, maybe it didn't hit that server. Oh, that one was important, you say. Or, okay, we've got the backups, but they got encrypted as well. Or even worse, we've got the backups. They're offsite. They're not encrypted. Let's connect them so we can restore. Oh, they're encrypted again now as well. So it's just, this is security 101, is having effective offsite read-only backups. And you'd be amazed at how many of our instant response clients don't. In fact, ransomware, it's safe to say that sorry, go ahead, John.
I got to jump in with one thing right here. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but test the backups.
Again and again and again.
Your entire BCM processes. I swear to God, this is a direct quote from a role I was in doing BCM, coordination from the InfoSec side. No, we can't run this failover test. Might break it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on. But that was test your backups. Doesn't matter if you have great backups if you didn't test them.
Yeah. And on the ransomware side, I think our clients fall into two broad camps. One is the client who's really annoyed that this has happened to them and wants us to come in to do the forensics to find out what the root cause was, because they either need to report it to a regulator or they just want to make sure this never happens to them again. That's group one. Group two is panicking. They are facing the imminent destruction of their business. They've lost enormous amounts, and they are absolutely panicking about how they can get this business up and running again. And the simple difference between those two groups is the quality of the backups. They've got good backups, they're calm. They're annoyed, but they're calm. And so time and time again, it comes down to such a simple thing as backups.
Will you accept it? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you accept it if I expanded your concept of backup to the entirety of a BCM process, a recovery process, and capabilities? Again, capability, that word, right? So not just backing up data, but basically having a plan, knowing your assets, backing them up safely and securely, read-only, as you said. Please remember that, read-only, and testing it and understanding what the recovery process is once that happens.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%, John. But again, I'm looking at baby steps. Just having good, decent backups in the first place is a bar that so many companies fail to meet. What you're talking about is great, but that's the second step after having the absolute basics.
That's very fair. That's a good. I tend to look at it from the optimal situation. I think you're more of a realist with most a lot of companies. Let's just say. I think what you just described, the panic, is also, even if you have having been through this, right? Even if you have good backups and you are fairly confident. I mean, one of my favorite YouTube channels refers to this, I think, as this kind of thing as a significant emotional event, right?
And a nice way of putting it, yes.
It is. This is the chieftain, is an Irish guy who does videos about tanks. I like tanks. I just want to keep talking about them. And one of his favorite catchphrases, "Oh bugger, the tank is on fire. How do we get out of it?" So this is basically the significant emotional event. How do you talk to your customers, even if they are prepared? There's going to be some element of freaking out there. Do you, in your experience, are you as much a bit of a psychologist, therapist as technological incident responder?
So listen, I started my career, I was a maths geek, and I went into cryptography. So I was about as, even the geeks call us crypto geeks. But one of the things they made me study in my business and computer science degree was organizational behavior and psychology. And I remember as a 20-year-old thinking, why are they wasting my time with this nonsense when I could be learning some more computer science? And now it's one of the biggest parts of the job. The psychology and the people skills and that management is one of the most important parts of responding to an incident. And there's a wonderful training documentary I saw on how to do this. It's called Pulp Fiction. I don't know if you've come across that particular one before, but I'm not going to go into the details. This is very bloody. You may or may not like movies like that. But there's one scene, there's a character called Mr. Wolf, and the bad guys get themselves into hideous problems, and they call this guy in, and he just walks into the middle of a conversation. Absolutely, as you're saying, one of the first things he's doing is keeping track of the people and their emotional state and trying to get them into a position where they can think straight and work out how to get themselves to where they need to be. It's a major part of the job. And sometimes it's just as simple as, listen, we work for clients around the world. A lot of the work we do is remote. We can acquire a server in Guam if we need to and analyze it in Australia and then ship the results to France. It's not a problem. But the one bit we really need to be on the ground for is walking in, looking the CEO in the eyes, shaking his hand and telling them it'll be all right and we'll make this work.
If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, right?
I actually, wonderful example of this yesterday. We're going through a major case in Southeast Asia at the moment, one of our clients. And just on the group chat, one of our engineers said, do you know, this guy is a key part of the vendor's IT personnel, but he's just been hospitalized with high blood pressure. And the instant response from one of my team was, yeah, don't worry about it, though. I'm already working on his tasks. It's that sort of, that take no prisoners, that immunity to stress, that ability to keep delivering no matter what happens to you. That's vital in a response plan.
Yeah, as a very excitable person myself, I feel personally attacked, but I thank you for very, very strongly confirming one of my most unpopular regular rants that an information security person is a highly multidisciplinary function that takes years to get these various aspects of what's required of them kind of integrate into their thinking. It's also I came up with this phrase a while ago. I could call it DDoS by CISO, because all the big supply chain attacks and threats 2020, 22, 23, even now, they tend to come on a Friday afternoon, and CISOs, please let your InfoSec people do their job. It's not helping them if you're calling their cell phone every 5 minutes. You're hired, if you haven't hired good people and you pay them good money and trust them, well, then it's too late, but you're not helping. What are some of the, you mentioned backups.
Mm-hmm.
The theme of this, as we discussed it originally, was surviving a breach, surviving an incident. What are kind of a few major observations and tips that you would give? Keep your calm, make sure the backups work. What other piece of advice? It's happened. You've gotten your data's encrypted, or your website is down, or whatever. What's some advice you would give your potential customers?
That's a lot of things, a lot to unpack there. I think one of the most important things is to think a little long term. When you come in and your servers are encrypted and the business is yelling at you, one of the first things you're obviously going to think to do is, how do I get the thing back up and running again? Now, what we often do is we get called in a couple of days later and they say, right, we've recovered the entire environment, we've overwritten everything, everything's working again, now tell us how it happened. And our response was, well, you've just destroyed all the evidence, we don't know. So once you're doing that initial response, one of the very first things clients need to think about is preservation of evidence. You need to, while you're recovering the servers, you need to have an image that's taken off that can be analyzed later. And this is important for a few reasons. One, your forensics guys won't be able to do anything without it. But more importantly, someone has attacked you. Someone's got in and done a lot of damage. Unless you know how, and unless you know what back doors they put in, you're not going to be able to stop them doing it a second time. So that root cause analysis is not just there to keep the regulators or your board happy. It's there to make sure you know how to stop this event happening to you a second time the next week. And we've seen a succession of companies who have botched that initial response, and then they call us back in again 3 months later, or 6 months later, or 12 months later, in the case of the one we're working on right now. So the preservation of the evidence is tremendously important, and that's not the first thing on people's minds when they're going through this.
That's a really good observation. I really like that, and it hits home because a couple of years ago, I had exactly this conversation with a gentleman in Australia who was involved in cybercrime investigations, and he lamented what he saw as the rapidly accelerating drive by what he called the business to get it done, right? When there's an incident, just process it, get us back on our feet, and then move on to the next thing, which has kind of taken away the ability of incident responders to really look into, okay, what happened, do root cause analysis, and prevent it from happening again. So this is really, I think, sage and important advice.
It doesn't. I mean, this comes back to what I was saying before. You need somebody on the team who understands how the business works and what drivers they're under, because the business aren't doing this just to break your balls, if you'll pardon the Americanism. They're doing that because the most important thing to them is getting the business working, fulfilling their contracts and earning money again. So you need someone who knows that's going to happen and plan for it. You can satisfy both. You image, you switch out, you replace. You build out on the cloud with cloud formation so that you can recreate a new environment and leave the old one mothballed. There are many ways of making sure this happens. But you need to think about it and plan for it as an incident response team in advance. You know these guys are going to be on your back to get everything working. So you've got to have the preparation ready to make sure you can still do what you need to do.
Which brings me to the $1 million, pound, euro, whatever question. This costs money. You know, immortal words of one of our team's finance guys a while ago. The thing you have to understand, John, is things cost money. Well, yes, they certainly do. Mm-hmm. How do I justify that preparatory expense of having the guy who understands the business, the coordinator, the people who can do the investigation afterwards, either on my team or on retainer as an external service? What kind of words am I as a CISO or an incident response capability manager or whatever using, risk manager, to go to the CFO, the CIO, the CEO and say, look, we're going to have to put in another $1 million, $500K, whatever, to make sure that we have that ability to recover afterwards when these guys really just want to get the thing back up and running?
Okay. It's a really simple answer to that one. And I'm going to preface this with, I am a consultant. I've got services to sell you. There's lots of stuff I was up. One thing I do not have to sell you, and I am not by law allowed to sell you, is cyber insurance. I am not an insurance broker. So now I've said that, buy cyber insurance. That's how you're meant to afford it. It's almost obligatory now, because you will not expect the scale of the costs involved in anything other than a small response. And you need to not be paying that yourselves, and you need to not have to worry about that in the middle of your response. Find your favorite broker, get a cyber insurance quote, and if it suddenly comes in as particularly high, you need to understand why it's coming in high and what they know about your security setup that you don't realize is quite so important.
Again, very, very timely. And anybody who is watching this, I strongly encourage you to check out the conversation I had yesterday with Anthony Hess about cyber risk insurance specifically. So precisely what you just said. That's a really good one. I I think there's been a lot of, we addressed this in our call yesterday, there's been a lot of confusion, for example, about Lloyd's saying, acts of war are no longer covered, which is broadly misunderstood, and, pricing and risk management. And I want to talk about one other aspect here. And I think this is what we touched on earlier, and that's regulation. Right? Regulators, especially in, I'd say, the EU, UK, and parts of the US, a few other jurisdictions, have increasingly gone the direction of preventative requirements, controls requirements for critical infrastructure sectors and critical companies that take away part of the decision-making process about what can I decide whether or not to invest and spend on either preparatory or reactive controls. I mentioned Ofcom earlier. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit more about that, what is increasingly, what are the regulators seeing? What's being required? Are they taking a stronger hand, in your opinion, in making sure that their charges, their stakeholders their constituents rather, are being better prepared to face the inevitable incident?
Well, Ofcom's a great example of that. And regulators normally tend to prefer to avoid the prescriptive approach. Because one, that means they've got to understand everything that's going to happen and have an answer for it. And that's hard. And two, it puts them in a position of fighting their industry into doing stuff. So most regulators tend to come in with a risk-based approach. You need to understand the risk and you need to have your own plans. And then they sit back and watch what the industry does. And if over time the industry is not doing what the industry needs to do, they are kidding themselves. The risks aren't that. Or I have the risk proposal and I've taken it to the board and they've said that's too expensive. They see the macro view of an entire industry and they can see what attacks are happening and they can see what does work and what doesn't work. So over time, they tend to start taking the decision away from industries that are not doing it properly themselves. So I think Ofcom were tremendously clear about this. There was a survey that came out a few years ago, which talked about the state of security in the telecoms industry. There were some recommendations that came out. They were, how do I put this politely, not entirely taken seriously by the industry, or at least they didn't implement a lot of it. And so now Ofcom is very clear that it's stepped in and it's become a lot more prescriptive about what telcos can and cannot do. And you were talking earlier on about the view that this is not just down to you anymore, you have an effect on the industry around you. And that's always true for critical infrastructure. And that's always going to be true for the telcos. They are such a fundamental part of IT and digital infrastructure now that the concept of cyber warfare is attacking exactly people like telcos and ports. In the 15th century, we would besiege a city and wait for them to starve. Now we just knock out the critical infrastructure and wait for them to turn to chaos. And then the tanks roll in to come back to your analogy. I mean, yeah, they only force you into doing something when they need to.
But I think you touched on a really good point, and that's with telcos. I mean, we've seen a massive wave of telco breaches over the last few years. I mean, as far back as TalkTalk in 2019, we've had AT&T and T-Mobile in the US. We had O2 in 2021, 22, I forget, right? And others. And it's really telling that financial services is one of the major drivers of information security maturity and investment, is kind of leading the charge in having a cross-sector interest in, I think, the two fundamental other industries that they depend on, those being telco and power, essentially, right? And it's really interesting to see, if you look at NIS2 in the NIS2 directive in the EU and Ofcom in the UK, that they're taking more of a focus on service providers as part of the service IT services supply chain in terms of, as you say, risk management capability development. So this is I find this really interesting because also for me, when I'm in a management role, I can justify expenditure. Back to the conversation about cyber risk insurance, I was able to do this with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and pointing to their technology risk management suggestions, guidance, say, okay, sure, you can cut my budget, but would you please explain to the MAS why you're doing this? I think as maybe a last point before we wrap up, can you talk us through a hypothetical? Now, this is a very, very broad question here, but just use your fantasy here, your experience. A very hypothetical breach, an incident. What happens? I'm a company X. I do something, important. I sell things, I make things, whatever, and I get alerted. What happens? How typically, is there a typical? When do you guys get called in? How do we recover? How do we follow up? Give us a few maybe example elements of that whole chain of events in your experience.
So the first bit is noticing that you've been attacked. And that can be quite hard to do sometimes. An attack manifests itself in those events in the log file as unexplained behavior. And unless you have somebody who is monitoring and who has the data that they need to monitor, it's often hard to notice when you've actually been attacked. And I think the industry timelines on noticing an advanced persistent threat is sort of, I don't know what the current number is, but it's usually somewhere around 140 to 150 days. From the date of the attack towards the date when the average company notices it. So the first is to notice you've been attacked, and then to have that ability to escalate up to somebody who can do something about it. And depending on your organization, that might be a CISO, that might be a COO, that might be someone tremendously different. Because we work mostly with law firms and insurance firms, we tend to only get called in after that realization has happened. It's more obvious than others. The companies we work with proactively ahead of the breach, they're usually the firms who are willing to invest in security and they do something about it before. So they tend to get attacked much less. But it's notification something happened and then getting the right team in the place. So somebody within an organization gets assigned responsibility for dealing with this problem. And then they have the next issue, which is getting the right people in place on that team. So you need the techs, you need PR people, you need lawyers, you need the communications people, you need someone who's going to actually manage the incident and keep that overbearing CISO away from the guys who are trying to analyze memory at the moment. So building that team is the next step. And then it's setting clear goals, clear boundaries. What needs to be recovered? By when? Do you need to notify? Who do you need to notify? Do you need to retain evidence? What are your legal obligations on your business partners or your clients? There's a whole step. Then, as I say, the next bit, the actual technical response list has got a great framework of containment, eradication, and so on. And you could do a whole lot worse than just following that wholesale. But if you spend a little time on adapting it to your enterprise, it's going to be working a lot better. But I say a lot of the real success and failure comes from putting that team together, getting the right guys in the right place and getting the right resources to them. As I say, I worked for Leeming during 9/11 and I was working in London office. And the first thing I knew, we were in an open plan. We were in a glass-walled meeting room on an open plan IT floor, and we could see something going wrong. There was a buzz going on. We couldn't see the news stream, so we didn't know what. And somebody walked over to the meeting room, knocked on the door, opened it, and said, "Gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you, but somebody's flown a plane into head office." Utterly calm, utterly in control of themselves. And it still strikes me as one of the strangest parts of the whole thing. But that characterized the response that Leeming did. It was professional. It was controlled. These guys saved the bank for another 7 years, but that's a different story. But it's that process of managing the incident and managing the people and managing communications that's going to be key to your survival.
I mean, playing devil's advocate could also be just shock. I know that was my reaction. We was like, what? So listen, I want to thank you very, very much for your insights on this. You've raised a couple of points, and I'm very grateful that you've confirmed a lot of the things I keep banging on about, like a broken record. So this is a bit of self-interest as well. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Some really, really good lessons, and I think anybody watching this or listening to this should take away a few of the key points, and that is, prepare, test, especially backups, keep calm, make sure you know
My insurance.
buy insurance, know what your assets are, risk management framework, etc. And none of these are exotic. Nothing here should be anything new to anybody in information or cybersecurity management or risk management, policy compliance, etc. So, hopefully we have reinforced some of the things that you should be aware of, you should think about, especially as a large critical organization, but not only. Even if you're a smaller company, you don't have to do it perfectly, but you do have to do it. You do have to prepare. You do have to think about it beforehand, because it is very likely it will happen, and your calculated risk, your calculated loss will not necessarily reflect the actual impact and extent of the damage to your business, your reputation, and the society that you work in when incident happens. And of course, make sure that nice people like Geoff, when things do go pear-shaped, whom whom to call to help you figure out what happened, and analyze it, investigate it, don't destroy evidence, and clean up afterwards.
Maybe if I can leave you with one thing. So as a business owner, Pragma, about half of our work is post-breach incident response, and half is pre-breach preventative consultancy. We will help you come in and secure your organization. As a business owner, that gives me a certain amount of calmness, because when I put out a proposal to a client for some preventative security consultancy and implementation, if they turn me down, I don't mind so much, because I know I'll be seeing them again in 2 years' time, and I charge more on that side of the shop than I do. It's always going to save you money to fix these problems before they become an incident. The best way to survive a security incident, to make sure it never happens in the first place.
And remember, those of us in the industry, we're not just out to plunder your wallet. We actually do want to help you and help you prepare, make sure the damage isn't as bad as it could potentially be. So maybe, we mean well. Yeah, with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you for your time. Please check out our other videos on youtube.com /cybersec advisors. Check us out. Check out our website at cybersecurityadvisors.network. That's still a bit of a mouthful. And any suggestions for future video topics would be more than welcome. And we'll link to Geoff, his LinkedIn profile, and to Pragma in the video and audio descriptions. And I hope to see you all in the next time. Stay safe, stay secure, stay calm, stay prepared, and have a great week.